We're still continuing with our news in Israel. Right now, Israel's population is growing at a dizzying rate, and unless the birth rate drops, experts say that the country could lose 10% of its open spaces by 2050, and that is a lot for a country that is the size of New Jersey. Now, if current trends continue, Israel's population will nearly double by the middle of this century to 17.6 million residents from its current 9 million. That is according to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics. And in that scenario, the pace of new home construction will also double, along with the need for more infrastructure to provide energy. Well, a study compiled by Knesset member and Professor Alon from Tel Aviv University reveals that the loss of open space as a result could translate to a devastating loss of natural habitats. And joining us to break this down himself and more is Knesset member, Parliament member, Professor Tal Alon from the Blue and White Party here in Israel. So, first of all, where does Israel's overpopulation problem actually come from, and what problems does it trigger?
Well, for most of Israel's history, the major engine behind population growth was immigration. But that has changed, and in the last couple of decades, it's really the very, very high birth rates that have been creating this tremendous population growth, 2% a year. Israelis have 3.1 children per family. That's almost twice the average in the OECD, and far higher than any other developed country, which means that even though we do a lot to try to maintain a high quality of life and improve the environment, when you're growing that quickly, it's awfully hard, and we're already seeing the growing pains.
What does this mean for the future of the environment in the state of Israel?
Well, I think it translates very, very poorly to our environmental future. Surely on the two cardinal issues of our day, biodiversity loss and climate change, what the population growth means is that we run basically on a treadmill, but don't get anywhere. So we've seen, for example, in our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is so critical to stabilize our climate, Israel, unlike other Western nations, which are all starting to cut back, actually has increased the amount of carbon which we release in the atmosphere. Per capita, we've come down, but our overall increase is really, really unfortunate given the imperative of improvement in this area. And biodiversity loss may be the most acute problem. Today, about 37% of all of Israel's animals are endangered with extinction. Just to give one example, the gazelle, the Israeli gazelle, which is sort of a keynote species, which you've always had, keystone species, was in the past 15,000 to 17,000 gazelles running around. Now we're down to 1,200 alone. Wow. And this is on our watch. And we look at it, almost all the major species that we try to follow, we've seen a reduction in population. And that's because of a habitat fragmentation. When you need to build 60,000 new housing units a year, no matter what you do, you're going to be losing open spaces at a tremendous rate. And that means there's no place for our fellow creatures to live.
Right. And I mean, just thinking about what that means, the loss of actual open spaces, what is going to happen when, families during the weekend want to go to the park? I mean, just thinking about the massive amounts of people that will be essentially coming together in the very few spaces that will continue to exist for our population is very frightening. I'd like to ask you, when it comes to population control, we already know how complicated that matter can be, especially in a state like Israel where religion is beloved. How can you enforce legislation on this issue or enact change when having children is such an important value in both Jewish societies and Muslim societies and Christian societies? What is the path here?
Okay, well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. Israelis increasingly are aware that quantity of life is degrading the quality of their life, and that's really the question of the recreational. Now, what is the path forward? Well, no country has managed to stabilize their populations without empowering women. In other words, when women have some alternative horizons in their life, besides being just a mother, when they can become doctors and attorneys and professors, then all of a sudden it seems that almost without trying, birth rates begin to drop. And reproductive autonomy contributes to that as well. Israel, there are certain sectors in our society unfortunately, where the glass ceiling for women is extremely low. So I would start by saying we need via public policies and legislation and incentives to really give women, all Israeli women, an equal chance. And that means getting rid of the tremendous gender gap in wages, but mostly offering the kind of training and educational opportunities that young women need. I think also it will be well, like many countries, to raise the marriage age, and so that young women will have at least a glance of what their options are before they start having children. There's a lot of other things we need to do also, which is to change the economic incentives. During the 1950s and 60s, for example, the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel only had about 2.6 children per family. But then we changed the whole economic framework for having kids and provided tremendous economic incentives, both in terms of child allowances and discounts in city taxes, all kinds of bonuses and public housing. The list goes on and on. Mm-hmm. So that's something we created, and the pendulum is swung very far. I'm hopeful that our present government is going to sort of reduce these so-called perverse incentives and tell people, if you want to do the right thing by society and have 2 children per family, 2.1 replacement levels, that's when you're going to get the incentives. Nobody should be forced to have a given number of children. I think nobody wants to live in a Chinese one-child policy country with all its violations of human rights. But we do want to tell people 2 children is the healthy way. Once it was patriotic to have large families, now the patriotic thing is to have 2 kids.
You know, I have to ask you, you are fresh in the Knesset, you're fresh in the Israeli parliament. You know, what you're saying right now theoretically sounds like the right path. The question is, how do you get people on board with something like this? And my question for you is, what is your biggest focus right now? What is the biggest change that you want to make now that you're in the government? Quick answer.
Well, I do, first of all, want to raise this issue. In my initial inaugural speech in the Knesset, I talked about all the impacts of what it means to have 3 million cars today and 10 million cars in 30 years. What does it mean? We have to triple the number of nurses and double the number of doctors in our hospitals, more than double the number of classrooms. And so getting people to realize that there is a significant economic and environmental price to this population growth is a start, because up until now, the narrative always been is that Israel's tremendous population growth is a success. And they have to realize that there was a time when that was very, very important. Israel was sparsely populated, but as the most crowded country in the Western world, that is no longer something which improves quality of life. And I think that bringing that message time and again really changes the way people look at this issue. And then we can start talking about, well, where do we go from here, and how do we change the public policies, provide, for example, we're going to ask in the Knesset this week, the Minister of Health, why isn't contraception provided to women for free in Israel as it is in so many European countries? There's so many things we could do to let women make the choice about the number of children they actually have, and provide families that are small with the benefits that they deserve for doing the right thing for the country.